Would you like to understand UVB for chameleons? This is a two-part video series on exactly that. At the end of these videos, you will have the foundation of knowledge necessary to understand what is being talked about on social media, hold your own in a conversation, and be able to sniff out sound bites that just don't seem right. This episode is about UVB and how we use it in chameleon husbandry. I'll be talking mostly about veiled chameleon husbandry, but also a little bit of panther chameleon and maybe some of the other species. My focus on veiled chameleons is more because there's more misunderstanding about that species than there are for the other species. In the past, I have done episodes on UVB, but I get the impression that it's difficult to learn from those videos and then apply it in real life. So I'm going to try a different tactic today and go over a sound bite that's bounced around on social media a lot, and let's go ahead and unpack it and learn UVB in how it relates to that statement. And the statement that I'm talking about is that panther chameleons should get a 6% or 5.0 UVB, and a veiled chameleon should get a 12% or 10.0 UVB lamp. While that statement sounds like just normal sound bites bouncing around social media, it's a great one to work with because when we unpack it, we can look at a number of levels of misinformation that was stacked on top of each other. I rarely give attention to any one soundbite bouncing around, but this particular one seems to have some staying power. And the only way we can flush our community of misinformation like this is if the community members understand the concepts and issues that go behind it. So to wipe this one off the docket, we have to replace it with something else that is more accurate. And for that, we need an understanding. So let's start with the premise that veiled chameleons need higher UVB than a panther chameleon. Or we can simplify it further and take the panther chameleon out of it altogether. Regardless of what levels a panther chameleon needs, what level of UVB does a veiled chameleon need? And is the Arcadia 12% or the Reptisun at 10.0 the right bulb for veiled chameleons? And perhaps we should talk about what this 5.0, 6%, 10.0, 12% is. These are all UVB bulbs. These are from the top manufacturers of UVB bulbs, Arcadia and Zoomed. Arcadia makes the 6% and the 12%. Zoomed makes the 5.0 and 10.0. These are all T5 fluorescent lights. The Arcadia 6% is equivalent to the Reptisun 5.0, and the Arcadia 12% is equivalent to the Reptisun 10.0. Now, those numbers are marketing designations, and so don't read too much into those. Just know that the 12% and 10.0 have a higher UVB output than the 6% and the 5.0, and Arcadia has a 14%, which has an even still higher UVB output. So, with that out of the way, let's take a look at what kind of levels of UVB a veiled chameleon might need. Now, I have the advantage that I know where all of this started. The idea that veiled chameleons are a high UVB species comes from many years ago on a Facebook group where an admin decided that his veiled chameleons got very big because they had high levels of UVB. He didn't use a solar meter, so we have no idea what levels he was working with. But the fact is that chameleons do not get bigger if you give them more UVB. Size is going to be because of temperature and how much food it gets. But he had a platform, and he wanted to tell everybody that veiled chameleons get bigger if you give them more UVB. Now, understanding the way UVB works, this really doesn't make sense. UVB hits the chameleon skin, and in our skin, it works the same way. And our skin uses that energy to start a process that synthesizes vitamin D3. Vitamin D3 is critical to our health because it allows our gut to absorb calcium, and that goes into building our bones and proper function of our organs. The thing is that there's only a certain level of vitamin D3 that we need, and the body shuts off production of vitamin D3 when it has as much as it needs. Anything more than that, and you're getting into an overdose situation because vitamin D3 is fat soluble. So the body doesn't want to do that. Now, when the body is done filling up its stores of vitamin D3, it tells the skin to stop production. And so any more UVB after that point only contributes to sunburns and skin cancer. The body is actively trying to block it. So giving more intense UVB, maybe it decreases the amount of time that the body needs to fill up its stores, but there's no mechanism in UVB that would make the body grow bigger. Now, obviously, we need calcium to grow, but it's not going to make this chameleon grow bigger just because it has higher levels of UVB. Now, you're saying, well, why didn't anybody correct him? We did. And even a bona fide PhD in biology, a chameleon scientist, corrected him. But when you're talking about social media, especially these Facebook groups, admins don't like to be told that they're wrong. And there's this sense that if you get more and more people to agree with you, it makes something that's wrong right. So his response to being corrected was to spread it even further. And maybe this is a good time to take a break and let that sink in. I know group leaders are viewed as experts in chameleon husbandry. And just keep in mind that expertise in chameleon husbandry is not what gets you on a team. And so I encourage you to use some other measuring stick as to whether you want to listen to a certain group. Size of group does not mean their information is accurate. But it's from these roots that the idea that veiled chameleons needed a T5 12% UVB bulb took hold. And it wasn't that the 12% will work, it is that anything lower than a 12% won't work. And this is why it's inaccurate, incorrect, misinformation. But we're going to go into why it is. So you're not just saying, okay, well, this guy says one thing, this guy says the other thing. But let's first go into a little bit of the natural history of veiled chameleons. The origin of veiled chameleons needing high UVB was incorrect, but it wasn't necessarily a ridiculous idea. Back then, the kind of images and videos we could get from Yemen showed veiled chameleons sitting on a sprig of branch in a wasteland, obviously being blasted by sunlight. So logically, it would assume that these chameleons had learned to live with high doses of UVB. So with these scraps of information, it wasn't a ridiculous idea. And even I thought this as well, because that was the information that I had. This all was counteracted when I searched the world to find some people that have actually been to Yemen to ask them, what's it like viewing veiled chameleons in the wild? And it wasn't easy to find these people because Yemen is in a long-term civil war. And so going there is actually risking your life. And so I had to find people who had been to Yemen before the civil war started. Not only that, I needed people who understood chameleons, were going there to look for the chameleons, and so they'd be able to answer the kind of questions that I had. And luckily, I found 3 people: Peter Netjas, Martin Wench, and Petko Dvorak. In talking to these 3, it became evident that our ideas of veiled chameleons were actually not correct. Veiled chameleons didn't come from a hot, arid, barren wasteland. They came from high-altitude mountain oases that, during the wet season, became these lush places filled with leaves and plants. And so veiled chameleons actually came from this paradise. And they would hatch at the beginning of the wet season and grow up as quick as they could to mate and put eggs into the ground, because when the dry season came, it removed all of the leaves, it took away all of their cover, and the veiled chameleons eventually die because of exposure. Yes, exposure to that sun and UVB that we thought they needed. No, we get the pictures because all of the leaves are gone. And so it's easy to take pictures of the chameleons. When all the leaves are there, it's really hard to take pictures of them because where are they? They're hiding. Which gives us another clue. They're hiding during the day. They're hiding from the afternoon sun. They get the sun in the morning to warm up, but then they go and hide. And during the day, the reports from Peter, who, by the way, was able to go multiple times, both the dry season and the wet season, and the only ones that would be out during the afternoon were the males that were up defending their territory. And in that case, they're not looking for UVB. They're tolerating the UVB so they can do the territorial thing, which, of course, if a chameleon needed UVB, it would be the females who were going to be using a lot of calcium. And so this was the time when they needed the most calcium, the most D3, and they were hiding. And so this in itself disputes the idea that veiled chameleons are high UVB species. Now, we still need to take into account that they're high elevation species, and so high elevation species tend to be used to higher levels of UVB, because the higher up you go, the less dense the air is, and the more UVB hits the ground. And we in the chameleon community experience this. Mario Youngman came on the podcast, did an interview, and talked about how his Trioceras hanagensis, which is a very high altitude species, would not give the bright colors unless they got a higher level of UVB, which makes sense. They come from meadows that are very high up, and chameleons that are high up develop a strong defense against UVB, so it takes a higher level of UVB to give them the same effect. And the yellow-crested Jackson's chameleon, which is actually at a lower elevation than veiled chameleons, seems to want higher UVB. Now, this is still something we're working with and trying to figure out, but it's not unreasonable to think that the veiled chameleons would need higher UVB. Now, none of these things were taken into account when the idea was first presented on Facebook. The guy literally thought, well, my chameleons are big, it must be due to UVB. So even though that was misguided, it's still a valid concept for us to think about. So now the question is, how do we test that? And that was a question that was on my mind. It's important that we test anything that we think we know. And at the time, I was already a number of years into the Chameleon Academy podcast, although it was called Chameleon Breeder Podcast back then. And the big question on my mind was, what UVB do our chameleons need? In the past, we just put on a UVB light and call it good. We'd give them some supplements that happened to have vitamin D3 in it. And so there was this mix of UVB light and vitamin D3, and we really didn't know what we were doing. So it was time that we organized that all and understood all the components and how it was affecting the health of our chameleons. So what does a veiled chameleon need for UVB? We had a scientific paper that introduced the idea of the Ferguson zones, which was ranges of UV index for various reptiles that was extrapolated from natural data and various data points here and there, but they weren't really tested extensively on actual animals. There was way too many species that they went over for them to do that. That's actually left up to us here. Those of us who live, breathe, and sleep a very distinct species of reptile, that's our job. It's time for us to take what they did and take it the step further. And that's what I was thinking we needed to do, but how to do that. The pebble that started the avalanche was when I was talking to Pete Hawkins, who's a herpetoculturist in the UK, and he was doing a test with Arcadia on a supplementation that did not have vitamin D3. And so his test was, would his female veiled chameleon be healthy while being given the supplement and only having a UVB bulb? Well, it turned out the test was a success. The chameleon was healthy through who knows how many months they were testing it. And that was all good and fine for the establishing that this supplementation worked. And that was that, except I said, wait a minute. Did you mention that your veiled chameleon had a clutch of eggs? And he said, yes. Well, was that clutch of eggs fully calcified? Yes. Okay, here we have something. Because in a chameleon's life, the biggest need for calcium is when a female is producing a clutch of eggs. All those eggs have to be covered in calcium. So this is an acid test as to, is the chameleon getting enough calcium? And as we know, anybody who's had a chameleon that has had eggs, sometimes the eggs come out and they're not fully calcified. The chameleon didn't have enough calcium. And so if we can do a test to show that at different levels of UV index, if the chameleon has a fully calcified clutch of eggs, we know that that UVB index is effective. Pete Hawkins was using UV index of 3. And so now the question was, is UV index of 3 better than, say, UV index of 6? The goal is to get the UVB index as low as possible and still be effective, because high levels of UVB are damaging to the skin. We get skin burns, skin cancer, and chameleon skin is affected similarly. So we don't want higher UVB than we need. Well, it took me almost a year to answer this question. I got 2 pairs of veiled chameleons. 2 were brothers, 2 were unrelated sisters. Well, at least as unrelated as you can get in the veiled chameleons in captivity. And I set them up to where in a garage where there's no other light coming in. They did not have any dietary D3, at least none that I added in. One had a UV index of 3, or one pair had a UV index of 3, one pair had a UV index of 6, and I raised them up from almost hatchlings. And the test was, first, would both the UV index of 3 and the UV index of 6 give me fully calcified eggs when they matured and mated? And would I see any noticeable difference between the UV index of 3 and UV index of 6? I was fairly certain that both were going to give me fully calcified clutches of eggs because Pete Hawkins already proved that it worked. But of course, I'm going to confirm it. I'm going to repeat the test. What I was really going to see is if UV index of 6 was going to give us any benefit. And the way I was going to measure that is more of a looking at, does the chameleon grow faster? Hey, heck, does it grow bigger? Why not? That's bouncing around social media. We'll see that. Is there any behavior changes in the chameleon? Is there anything that I can notice different between UV index of 6 and UV index of 3? So in the end, yes, they both had fully calcified clutches of eggs, and there was no difference as far as growth or behavior. And so the conclusion to this test was UV index of 3 is effective, and there is no reason to go up to UV index of 6. And this is a test that anybody could recreate. And so it left the question of, why should we go above UV index of 3? And the answer is, we shouldn't unless we can show that there is a benefit to go higher UVB. To this day, there's not been a testable reason that tells us we should go above UV index of 3. And just to put some context as to where it went from there, after I talked about this test on the Chameleon, well, at that time it was a Chameleon Breeder podcast, Jonathan Hill of iPerdalis heard that and repeated that test on his panther chameleons. And so we have multi-generations of panther chameleons that have been raised on UV index of 3 and no dietary D3. And so we have the evidence that UV index of 3 is an effective basking level of UVB for panther chameleons as well as veiled chameleons. Fast forward a few years and Dr. Michael Nash took the helm and did a study as to the growth rates of carpet chameleons between UV index of 3 and UV index of 7. But, spoiler, the end result was that the babies at UV index of 3 fared better than the ones at UV index of 7. So we've got a number of data points confirming that UV index of 3 is a good basking level. It doesn't mean that in the future we won't find a better value. Maybe UV index of 2 is better unless it's a gravid female, and then UV index of 4 is better. I don't know. I just pulled those numbers out of the air. But we've established an understanding that UV index of 3 is effective. Doesn't mean we won't find a better value in the future, and it doesn't mean that we won't find better values for each species. But the point is that you see the domino effect of when people take their tests seriously, it ends up going somewhere. Dr. Nash's study is a peer-reviewed, published study. All right, now's a good time to demystify these UVB bulbs. Currently, the T5 fluorescent bulb is the most widespread used source of UVB. Now, LEDs are coming into that and is going to kick the fluorescent lights out. Hasn't happened yet, but writing's on the wall. It is happening as we speak. That said, I'm going to be talking about T5s in this episode because that's where most of our UVB is happening right now. Now, when you say T5, that is a certain technology of fluorescent bulb. These fluorescent bulbs are specially manufactured to produce UVB, but you will see light coming off of these bulbs. That is in the visible spectrum. That is not UVB. We can't see UVB. So seeing light on the bulb doesn't mean you're getting a good UVB output. You need a UVB meter for that. The standard that we're using today is a solar meter 6.5, which measures in units of UV index. This is what the World Health Organization uses to determine how fast we're going to get a sunburn when we're in the sun. And yes, the same wavelengths that allow us to synthesize vitamin D3 and allows our body to grow is the same wavelengths that gives us sunburn and skin cancer. So, thank you, nature, for that. We used to measure UVB by microwatts per centimeter squared, and you will run into that in some of the previous UVB papers. Every UVB bulb goes through a life cycle. When you first plug them in for about 100 hours, they come out with a very high UVB level. They go down after the burn-in time and they plateau a bit. But during that plateau, they're slowly degrading over the life of the bulb, which is generally accepted to be 1 year. The UVB output of the bulb and the life of the bulb is dependent on a number of things, including how often it's used, how long it's used, when it is used, and the quality of the fixture that's driving it. So there will be a wide variation in people's experiences. That's why a meter is very useful. Okay, to fully appreciate what's coming off of this bulb, let's go ahead and give you a context for what all these numbers mean. First of all, let's start at UV index of 0. This is nighttime. There's no light. You're not getting a sunburn and you're not making vitamin D3. UV index of 3. Now this is our target chameleon basking level. UV index of 8. This is where fair-skinned humans start to burn in about 10 to 20 minutes. Remember, this UV index scale is based on humans getting sunburns. UV index 11, well, this is where fair-skinned individuals start to burn in 5 to 10 minutes. UV index of 13 is more or less where the common species of chameleons, this is what they experience during the afternoon. This isn't necessarily what they're basking under, this is what's in their natural habitat. They're basking in the morning when the UV index is between, say, 1 and 3. And then UVI 43.3 is the highest UVI found on Earth. This is the Licancabur volcano in Bolivia. So now that we have an understanding of what UV index is from 0 to a blistering 43, that combined with the rest of the foundation that we've put into place, we're in a position to where now we can talk about how to execute the actual setup of UVB in our chameleon cages. When I come back in the next episode, we're going to be doing a test on a UVB bulb, and you're going to be able to see how we map out those gradients that we're talking about. And then we'll talk about how to apply it directly to your chameleon cage. And once the next video is launched, it's going to be linked in the end screen. If you're interested in participating more deeply into the Chameleon Academy, join the Chameleon Academy weekly email newsletter. Every week you're going to be getting a different topic that we're going to discuss, and then I integrate the discussion into the next week's podcast or YouTube video. And if you want to be part of an active and healthy chameleon community, that's the first step. Thank you for joining me here. My name is Bill Strand. I'll see you next time.